mechanisms of the reincorporation. We have also a group of academics doing research on these issues, and for that reason, this partnership is so important. But we also believe in this culture of dialogue as something that makes us unique. And this is what I would like to share with you now, so that this could be as a framing agreement to have this seminar today. So the first thing, sorry, can you hear me? So the 6 principles that I would like to share are the following. First, we believe in respect. We want to hear different opinions and different points of view here. So this is a space of trust where that's possible. Second, the principle of co-responsibility. We believe that this space can help us to understand how we can contribute to peace building. Third, the principle of honesty. We feel that here people can say what they think and they feel about these issues. Fourth, the principle of generosity. We believe that this space is a space where we can give the best of ourselves. Fifth, the principle of solidarity. We understand that this is important to contribute to a better world for all the people who are in vulnerable situations. And finally, the principle of self-criticism, and is that here we have an opportunity to think about our cognitive bias and the prejudices that sometimes we carried on to interpret reality. And we hope that we have more tools in order to reassess that. So we invite you to follow those principles. And without further ado, I hand over this to Gwen Burnyeat, who is going to be the chair of the seminar as usual.
Thank you so much, Andre, and thank you all very much for coming and spending this hour and a half together with us and with our fantastic speakers today. And thank you so much, Annette and Michael, for accepting this invitation to be part of the Embrace Dialogue Academia series. On behalf of Merton College, as well as Rodemos de Diálogo, welcome. It's a really fantastic partnership that we're able to have between the college and RED to really try to build spaces where we can have a sort of very focused dialogue around how recent academic research can contribute to policy debates and trying to pick out the implications in practical terms of what high-level research on Colombia on issues around peace and conflict might be. That's the purpose of these spaces. Today we have our Embrace Dialogue Academia seminar number 6, and we're very privileged to have with us today as the presenter Dr. Annette Idler, who is visiting scholar from the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University, and also the Director of Studies at the Changing Character of War Center here at the University of Oxford, and who's going to be discussing her paper, The Logic of Illicit Flows in Armed Conflict, explaining variation in violent non-state group interactions in Colombia, from her article published last year in World Politics, which I'm sure we can get a link put into the chat for you if you're interested to follow up on what she presents today. And discussing her paper will be Dr. Michael Weintraub, who's Associate Professor at the School of Government at the Universidad de los Andes. And I think that one of the real privileges of this series has been being able to have speakers from around the world, from Colombian and non-Colombian universities, Colombians and non-Colombians, who all share an interest in academic research on interdisciplinary aspects to do with peace and conflict in Colombia, and trying to think through how their research can contribute to solving the problems of conflict and violence in Colombia today. And so the format that we're going to run through is, first of all, we will have a presentation by Annette for about 30 minutes. Then Michael will spend about 10 minutes trying to pick out the policy implications of Annette's paper for peace-building challenges in Colombia today. And then we will go to a dialogue with the audience. You will have the opportunity to ask questions in person, or rather through the in-person mechanism that we have here, with your own voice. I mean, if you choose to, although we are live streaming on YouTube and this will be recorded for posterity. So if you prefer not to be recorded, but you'd like to ask a question, then you can ask it via chat, either to everyone or anonymously to me if you prefer not to be named. But we do encourage you to ask questions yourself if you would like to, because that makes it more of a dialogue. And we'll try to have maybe 2 rounds of 2 to 3 questions each round, and then we will wrap up, and we'll give the speakers a chance to respond to both, and we'll hopefully get a bit of a dialogue between the 2 of them. So without further ado, I will hand over to Annette to present her paper. Annette, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me just see if I can share my screen. Can you see the slide? Yeah? Okay, great. But thank you so much for inviting me to present the work, and thanks also to Michael for accepting to be the discussant, and thanks everyone for being here. I'd like to just give a little bit of context of where I'm coming from with this work. So this is pretty much anchored in one program and one project that I'm leading. One is the Changing Character of Conflict platform, where we look at dynamic change in armed conflict and the different factors, the different dimensions that are relevant for that. Colombia is one case study here, but we also take this global. We look at other cases like Myanmar, for example, which is very relevant right now, but also cases in Africa, in the Middle East, and see how we can take this further there. The other program is ConPeace, From Conflict Actors to Architects of Peace. And that is a research program at Pembroke College, CCW, and the Department of Politics and International Relations, where we look specifically at the changing security landscape in Colombia. We started in 2016, in the year of the peace negotiations, peace deal then as well. And there we look mainly at the gap or the disconnect between marginalized regions in Colombia and the center, and how different visions of security and of security architecture also affects how peace building is happening right now in the country. So in that paper, I draw on both areas, and I'd also like to acknowledge the generous support that we received from the Canadian government and also from Research Councils UK, from the Partnership for Conflict Crime and Security Research. So let me start by taking you to, let me see if I can move the slides, by taking you to Tumaco. Here, a resident said to me in 2011 during one of my fieldwork trips, they don't have a territorial dispute. When they kill each other, it's for retaliation because they lost a cocaine shipment, or someone important has been killed or arrested by the state forces, and they think this is to take someone out of the market. Soon afterwards, they come to terms again. Sorry. They come back and talk to each other, do something to calm down, and things continue as usual. Now, this is an important example of an arrangement between leftist guerrilla groups and right-wing paramilitary groups. Note that this was in 2011 when the conflict was still ongoing. And despite the Colombian conflict's cleavages along ideological lines, which is reflected in armed clashes between guerrillas and paramilitaries in some parts of Colombia, groups from across the political spectrum have also forged these kind of cooperative short-term and long-term arrangements. And that is not just the case in Colombia. We see that in other regions, such as the Great Lakes region, in Libya, in the Golden Triangle, in Mexico. So basically, we see how single individual violent non-state groups, and by that I mean rebel groups, the guerrillas or paramilitaries, but also criminal groups, engage in various types of interactions with other groups within the same unstable setting, like Colombia. So regardless of their political or their economic motivation, they forge either stable long-term relations in some regions, or they engage in unstable short-term arrangements in others, and they dispute each other elsewhere. And this is really at the core of what I'm looking at in this paper, to understand why is it that we see such a variation in those interactions. So the question is, why do interactions among violent non-state groups within the same armed conflict vary? Now, I just go briefly over what the literature has to say on that. Where first of all, there's a literature on the conflict crime nexus, which usually starts more from the macro level to see, for example, the networks that are connected with each other. If there is field work involved, it often starts in the more urban areas, but not necessarily in the rural areas to see what is happening. It hardly goes into detail in terms of what exactly this nexus actually means. There's another literature from the Civil War studies on territory, where usually one argues that different groups, they fight for territorial control. And then there's another literature that looks at motivations of armed groups, but that is usually about why would these groups fight in the first place? What is their raison d'être? What motivates them to engage in armed struggle? Now, I argue that we need to go beyond these different types of literature and actually think about all these three areas differently. Think differently about territory, think differently about motivations, and also think differently about this link between conflict and crime. So I argue that the spatial distribution of illicit supply chain networks influences variation in the interactions among violent non-state groups. So I have three steps in this overall argument. The first one is that I conceptualize what I actually mean by illicit supply chain networks. In the second one, I then discuss what these violent non-state group arrangements are. How do we understand these different forms of cooperation? And then in the third step, I theorize how the function of a specific locality in an illicit supply chain network influences the type of violent non-state arrangement that occurs there through one of two causal mechanisms: interest convergence and shared values. I'm going through all of these steps in more detail, but this is basically the argument and the theory in a nutshell. So let's start with the first step, the illicit supply chain networks. Usually we tend to think about that as a linear chain, as we can see here. So this is basically the cocaine industry, right? There is, first of all, the resource extraction. One has to extract coca, the coca leaves in that case. These are then processed from coca leaves into cocaine, transported first domestically, and then trafficked internationally to the market in, for example, the United States or in Western Europe. But actually, it looks much more complex. It's not a single chain, it's an entire network, or actually several overlapping networks, the illicit supply chain networks. So as you can see here on this graph, there are different connected flows that enter this linear chain. So for example, in order to process the coca leaves into cocaine, we'd need precursors, chemicals or gasoline to actually do that process from coca to cocaine. In order to transport the drugs, usually groups have to cross territory that is controlled by other groups. So that means they need to get involved in barter agreements in order to have the permission to do that. That can be, for example, drugs for arms deals. It can also be spot sales. And all of that is coordinated in logistics centers. And then, of course, once you get to the market, you need to consider what to do with the profit. And this is where the money laundering comes in order to then reinsert the finances into the economy. All of these different steps are connected at the beginning through financiers. So these are little known middlemen who coordinate, who buy the coca leaves, for example, and bring them to the next stage. And then the further you move up in the chain, the more powerful these brokers become. And these are the ones then who are coordinating those different steps. Now, this basically reflects the cocaine supply chain, but you can think about other illicit economies, about other forms of transnational organized crime, such as the oil trade in Syria, the heroin trade in Afghanistan, charcoal trade in Somalia, minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So these are all similar phenomena that have a similar way in which they operate in terms of these networks. And they can be analyzed then, these networks, along 4 dimensions. First of all, the input-output structure. What is the raw material, if you want, at the beginning, and what comes out? The territoriality. How can we map those networks across space? The institutional context. Is it happening because of weak state governance, for example? And then related to that, also the governance structure. Well, if there is no state, if there is no legal economic opportunity, who provides the governance of that very network? So this is the first part, to basically understand how in Colombia and in other places those illicit supply chain networks function. Now I then add to that the other part, to look at how those different groups come in. So if we spatially map the supply chain, we see certain regions with trafficking nodes. These are the areas that you could see at the graph before, where different flows converge. And then, of course, there's also the production side, which are the areas where there's coca cultivation and where you have labor-intensive where the labor is very intensive, with local communities involved. Now, what I argue is that it depends on these kind of function of the locality if we want to understand what kind of cooperation among violent non-state actors we see. So the causal mechanisms here are that in locations of trafficking nodes, the interests of different violent non-state groups converge, and therefore they engage in unstable and short-term arrangements, whereas in production sites, shared values are necessary in order to make the cooperation more long-term and more stable. Now, what do I mean with these causal mechanisms exactly? Well, the starting point is that in a context, in a multi-party context, multi-party conflict, as it was in Colombia and still is in terms of the groups that are continuing, these operate in distrust. It's similar to what we can think of with the anarchy under which states operate. So if the starting point is distrust and violent non-state groups do not have the same kind of mechanisms that states have, for example, to overcome that distrust, such as legally binding agreements, they need to find other mechanisms to reduce that distrust in order for them to be able to cooperate. So these are the different motivations. There's interests, there's also personal bonds, there's shared values, and then there's power. And here in this paper, I focus on the interests and the values because they are most relevant to understand these short-term and long-term arrangements in the context of the illicit supply chain. So basically, whenever the different groups have converging interests, that reduces their distrust sufficiently for them to engage in this form of cooperation. But it's only interest convergence. It's only in one particular moment, in the moment of the business deal, which is why it does not allow for long-term cooperation. And then on the other hand, with shared values, that can also happen through a third party, a third broker, if you want, an intermediator, who's either actively sharing values with the other two parties, or who's trying to make them believe that they are sharing values, because then again, the different groups would cooperate with that third party, which then allows for those stable long-term arrangements. So what does it mean then in practice in Colombia? This is based on long-term research that I carried out in Colombia's borderlands, which was related also to the book that came out on borderland battles, violence, crime, and governance at the edges of Colombia's war, where I've looked at how violent non-state group interactions influence security. So in this paper here, I don't look specifically at the security of local communities. I look instead at what drives those different types of cooperation and how is it linked to illicit supply chain networks. I spent a decade from 2008 to 2018 to collect the data in several fieldwork trips across the Colombian, Ecuadorian, and the Colombian, Venezuelan border areas. So I looked at 3 countries, and that is important because these arrangements continue on the non-Colombian side of the border, on the Ecuadorian and the Venezuelan side. I therefore looked at these 4 border cases, 4 border zones. I studied 100 interactions. These are the cases, what types of cooperation the different groups have. And I conducted 606 interviews with different types of stakeholders, ranging from refugees, displaced people, local communities, over NGO or international organization representatives, to state officials and ex-combatants. Now, why are these border areas so important if we want to understand this link between these illicit flows? And by that, I mean flows of money, of goods, of people, and the armed conflict on the other hand, which determines, as I argue, these interactions. Sorry, this one was missing. Well, first of all, they are strategic sites of coca cultivation, coca processing in laboratories, and they also comprise the starting points of the international trafficking routes. So this is at the Pacific coast, mainly the Departamento de Nariño, especially Tumaco, and then at the Caribbean coast, La Guajira as another starting point of the trafficking route. Secondly, these areas are also sites of retreat of different conflict actors, because they can cross the border where they continue to operate, but it serves a little bit more as a safe haven. And then thirdly, these areas offer many opportunities in terms of income sources for many different armed groups. So the FARC used to have their financing fronts in the border areas in order to engage in business deals across the border. And the groups that operate today also have an interest in being in those locations where these business deals can be struck. So how do I then go about the empirics? Well, first of all, I map those illicit supply chain networks across Colombia. Secondly, I then identify and map these Vale non-state group arrangements that coincide spatially with networks to see what is the actual overlap. Thirdly, I then process trace the connections between the networks and the arrangements. And then finally, I explain the variation in the dependent variable through within case and cross case analysis. So I look at individual cases, and here I focus for the trafficking nodes on Tumaco and on Llorente, both located in Nariño. And then for the long-term arrangement for the production side, I look at Catatumbo at the border with Venezuela, both pre-2015 and post-2015, because this is where the situation changes, and I'll come back to that. So what about the first step here, mapping illicit supply chain networks? As you can see here on this map, there are several different flows that cross the border, and these include cocaine as the main flow. So this was the linear chain also that you saw at the beginning, but this is interlinked with flows of gasoline, of arms, of precursors, and money. The same then is the case here at the Colombia-Venezuela border, where again, there are different flows that are overlapping of cocaine on the one hand, moving from Colombia to Venezuela and then leaving the country, but then also precursors, which all concentrate in this one area in the Catatumbo region, where we can also find coca cultivation and laboratories. So these are strategic locations if we look at them through the lens of the illicit supply chain networks. I then look at where different armed groups operate. Now, just here to say that this was between 2011 and 2013 in this map, but continuing to study the area right now, we can easily replace group labels and adjust the presence a little bit, but we would have a very similar picture today with different group labels in terms of where groups are present, where they're concentrating, and how they interact with each other. So here you can see number one, or the numbers, several numbers spread out through the map. With one, these are the unstable short-term arrangements, the spot sales of arms, for example, and barter agreements, or tactical alliances, for example, in Tumaco. Whereas then the number three, which is, for example, in Putumayo, in Bajo Putumayo, close to San Miguel, you'd have supply chain relationships. And this involves several different groups. Again, I did the same for the Colombia-Venezuela border and tried to identify where the different groups are operating and how they are relating to each other. And again, this is the map, a snapshot basically, from around 2011 to 2013. But if we look at the situation today, we would no longer have the same group labels necessarily, but we would have similar constellations in terms of how those groups relate. And again, we identify areas with unstable short-term arrangements, for example, close to Maicao or on the Venezuelan side in Maracaibo. And then the more long-term stable arrangements, the supply chain relationships, as you can see on the map, for example, here close to Ocaña, Tibú in the Catatumbo region. So how can we then explain, first of all, why there are short-term unstable arrangements in places like Tumaco, which was the case of the quote that I showed at the very beginning? Well, here you can see flows of cocaine from Colombia, from the border areas going to the United States, but also to Europe via West Africa. And the Pacific coast is the starting point of that route to the United States. So Tumaco is a strategic location for where the cocaine is being shipped abroad, which means that it's strategic to have profit arising from the cocaine trade for many different armed groups. And this is what we see even more here also through this quote. So here again, it's the map, a little bit more colorful this time, to see the different flows and see how they're all converging in Tumaco. And just to give an example of from one of my interviews, here someone said they join forces to send the quantity of cocaine that is required. So they refers to different armed groups. This ensures their security. The more united they are, the more likely it is that the Colombian state will not catch them or their products. They all have informants and intelligence on the state's operations. This is what unites them. So again, the reason for this cooperation is not necessarily an ideological one or why groups would fight in the first place. It is because in that particular moment, it is convenient, economic interests converge, and this is why groups would engage in cooperation. But this cooperation is unstable and short-term because it reduces distrust only in that particular moment. Now I look at another case of Llorente, and that is interesting because Llorente is a much smaller town. It's on the road that connects Pasto with Tumaco, but it's in a very rural area, and it's not where we would expect kind of harsh competition if we think about the literature on territorial pressure, for example, in urban areas, in places like Medellin. We would not expect that kind of competition in a village, pretty much in the middle of nowhere, if you want, on this road. And yet we see that in Llorente there are these short-term forms of cooperation among different types of violent non-state groups. So here I've selected this quote from someone who says that, referring to Llorente, not only narcos go there to do business, also FARC and paramilitaries, both groups. Everyone goes there for business. Those who go expose themselves to an imminent risk, but they know how to move about in these risks. They know how to sail through troubled water. So here, the key point to know is that Llorente is one of these trafficking nodes. If we look at the illicit supply chain network, this is where different flows connect. This is where it's strategic to have presence. And at least at that time, still, it was on this crucial road where different flows had to go through. And this is how we can explain then the short-term arrangements. Now, what about the other part, the production sides, and how can we understand why different types of violent non-state actors engage in long-term cooperation? So again, here I've referred to groups such as the guerrillas on the one hand and the paramilitaries on the other hand, who we would normally expect to fight. So here you can see both maps next to each other, the one that shows the illicit flows and where they're concentrated, and then on the other hand, number 3, the concentration of the stable long-term arrangement as a supply chain relationship in the Catatumbo region. Now, what's important here again is to understand why is it that it's possible to engage in that long-term cooperation, and that long-term cooperation is necessary for the illicit supply chain to work, because you have to have a certain institutional stability to make sure that you constantly have, first of all, the coca cultivation, then you have someone arranged to pick the coca leaves up to then move forward to the processing, and then make sure you have someone who's then moving forward with that to the trafficking. So this is what's called the route. The route is not just a geographical, a spatial way of looking at the cocaine flows. It's also all the mechanisms, the logistics in terms of how to move that, how to bring that together. And here, before 2015, the key point here was Megateo, who you can see on the left side was described as El Capo del Catatumbo. But on the right side, a local community leader described him like that. Megateo is a farmer who talks and understands the rural issue ideologically. People appreciate him, including FARC and ELN. Megateo creates respect. He imposes order. He's a man who understands the people and talks to them in their own language. He's a brother. He has become a role model. A police official described him to me in the following way. Megateo made everyone talk to each other. Guerrillas, narcos, criminal groups, the authorities. This grand man fuses their business, and he has become a patron. He is trustworthy to all of them. So this is the key point here. First of all, this kind of broker has the ability to show certain shared values, whether they are actually shared or not, does not matter at this point here. But he creates this image first of all, for local communities, farmers who are involved in that he's a role model, he's a brother, and therefore shares certain characteristics. And at the same time, these shared values are also presented in a way that make the different armed groups cooperate with him, and that stabilize then the cooperation and the institutional arrangements of the supply chain in the long term. And the key factor here is this trustworthy. This is how it's being perceived by the others. Now, what happened after 2015? 2015 was the year when Megatero was killed. It was in international media, so it was not just something that was known locally. So BBC reported about it as Victor Navarro dead, Colombia kills most wanted drug lord. The New York Times reported about it as Colombian military kills warlord of rural cocaine fiefdom. So what happened then afterwards? Well, afterwards, several groups competed for power. They tried to replace or fill that void. And that, of course, first of all, created more violence, but it was also a sign of the difficulty of replace that very actor. Because it's not just any third party, you would also have third parties or intermediaries in more urban areas, for example, to exchange messages or just to deliver certain goods. Here you need the additional component, which is a certain duty of fidelity. So these shared values, that people would actually trust the person to be reliable, to be a credible business person in order to make those more long-term deals and not just one-off deals with them. So to develop such a credibility and reliability requires building experience and reputation over time, which is what Megatero did. And that's why these figures are not easily replaced. So what does all of this then mean in terms of how we can understand the logic of illicit flows, the way I call it, in conflict, and how they influence the different interactions? So first of all, with regard to the territory, it's important to know that it's not just about territorial control, or that it's not just about different groups competing for territorial control. Actually, they often share that territory, which is what you saw on the maps before. And mapping those illicit supply chain networks enhances understanding of security dynamics. So on the one hand, if we know where those networks are and where the trafficking nodes versus the production sites are, then we have a better understanding of where we can expect those stable long-term arrangements, where we might not necessarily see a lot of violence between those groups, but probably a lot of mistrust also towards the local community, versus where we see those unstable short-term arrangements, which puts people at risk because they are exposed to those quickly shifting alliances. And then the other way around as well, if we can identify where there are these short-term arrangements or long-term arrangements, that can give also information on where it's likely to have production sites or trafficking nodes. Then secondly, on motivations, understanding why groups engage in short-term arrangements reveals locations where conflict actors acquire supplies and finances that prolong insecurity. So here, one important point is that these short-term arrangements are often misunderstood as violent competition, as enemies. In many studies, we conflate this kind of competition with those short-term arrangements. So it's seen, for example, in the case of Llorente, just as violent clashes, which would mean that there's enmity between different groups, but actually this violence here results from the fact that these alliances break down. So there are these short moments of cooperation, and they are very important to capture because it's a different kind of violence. It might produce the same number of victims, but the reason why they are victims is very different. It might be for suspicion of knowing about those deals and not necessarily because people are on the other side. So again, this is important if we want to understand how to protect those people who are at risk. And then finally, on the conflict crime nexus, cross-fertilizing conflict studies and crime studies brings benefits to both sides. So it's important to not just engage in more kind of the conflict research on the one hand or criminology on the other side, but actually we can learn from both disciplines and bring them together, both through methodology, but also through the literature, the theories, helps us better understand what's actually going on in contexts like Colombia. Now, I know that Michael will talk about the implications. I just wanted to briefly highlight 2 points, which I think we can then pick up here that are important. So the first one is that spatially mapping illicit supply chain networks demonstrates that each site requires distinct interventions to reduce insecurity and curb illicit activities. So here the important point is that even though in that case the data that I collected was doing ongoing armed conflict, we've continued with the CONPEACE program, the data collection until now. In this year, even we've collected data as well, and we see exactly the same patterns. So we basically, if we know where the trafficking nodes are, this means we need to think about accountable military and police presence, not just military and police presence, I emphasize the accountability here, and provide job opportunities that can help protect locals from the insecurity. On the other hand, if we look at production sites for these illicitly used goods, then we need to think about how the state, the government, must compete against the perceived legitimacy of those non-state actors that are providing opportunities in the illicit economy. So enhancing state presence and legitimacy by providing illegal economic opportunities is what can actually undo those stable arrangements in those areas. And that also means that these economic opportunities can suppress the shared values that guarantee the steady supply of the raw material for the cocaine production and thereby disconnects the supply chain steps. So if basically local communities have someone else to look to, they don't need the protection from someone like Megateo, well, that makes them more likely to also engage in other economic opportunities. So that's why this protection and the opportunities need to be provided for them. I'll end here. I think my 30 minutes, I've used them up, but I look forward to comments from Michael and of course also to the discussion. Thank you.
Amazing, Annette. Thank you so much. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation. And I think it could not be more timely amidst a climate of renewed debate on the way of implementing point 4 of the peace agreement and the application of the holistic model of targeting the multiple facets of the drug trade versus the more militarized strategy that has been preferred by the Duque and the Trump administrations of forced eradication. Perhaps if you could stop sharing your screen now and we will hand over to Michael. Over to you.
Great. So thanks so much, Merton College, of course, at Oxford, to Gwen for Embrace Dialogue, and of course to Annette for giving me the opportunity to reread this paper, to reread this article that she published in World Politics last year. So you all heard about the extraordinary fieldwork that Annette carried out for this project, more than 600 interviews in some of the country's most difficult places. And of course, thanks to her for helping us understand how variation in bargains struck among violent non-state groups works. Some of these are highly temporally constrained, some of these are far more durable. And she traces this variation, just to summarize again, to how the supply chain networks are structured, and in particular, if a given location serves primarily as a production site or a trafficking node in an illicit supply chain. So as you all have heard, I've been asked to provide comments that focus on the policy implications of the article, but I would like to start with just one methodological comment that I think, while it initially might seem purely academic and a bit abstract, has consequences for the policy implications that we can draw from Annette's article. So one of the important scope conditions of Annette's article is that the argument only applies to instances where there are not, I'm going to quote Annette, sorry, where there are not considerable intergroup power asymmetries whereby one group fully or almost fully controls a territory. So kudos to Annette for very clearly telling us where the argument should apply and where it shouldn't apply, and trying to get us to understand where we should expect to see these causal mechanisms at work. But I think at the same time, it's crucial for policymakers to understand how frequent these instances of considerable intergroup power asymmetries occur. Like, in what percent of the total production sites or strategic trafficking nodes, for example, does one group benefit from overwhelming control? So here I'll just project very quickly, if I can, very simple slides that I just created very quickly. So it could be that considerable power asymmetries are essentially absent in all the production sites and strategic trafficking nodes in Colombia, or most, and that means that Annette could be explaining a significant portion of the variation in these violent non-state group relationships, and I'll talk about what that might mean for policymaking in just a second, and that's of course what this slide would show here. But if something different is happening across the full universe of cases, of these strategic trafficking nodes and these production sites, if this pattern is reversed, the vast majority of production sites or strategic trafficking nodes are characterized by asymmetric power relations, then this argument may well only explain a very few cases. And I'd love for Annette to tell us a little bit about what she thinks about the distribution of the full cases in Colombia, because I think that's going to be important. Why? So I'll stop sharing my screen just for a second. I think this is important because the tools that are available to states, in particular to the Colombian government, and in this case that we're talking about here, can help create the conditions either for the kinds of asymmetric power relations that would make Annette's argument less relevant, or vice versa. So I want to imagine three scenarios. So one in which state efforts to target all armed groups in a given area evenly results in degraded coercive capacity for all groups. So basically the relative balance of power among them hasn't changed. Right? Let's imagine another second scenario in which effectively targeting the most powerful group in a given location makes the playing field more even among them, resulting in increasing relevance, I think, of your argument, Annette, for the emergence of more symmetric power relations. And finally, a third scenario in which it's basically, because it's operationally easier to go after smaller or weaker groups, that has the effect of exacerbating the power asymmetries among them. And therefore, that makes your argument less relevant overall. And I think, when we start to think about what kinds of interventions the Colombian government has typically adopted and which it's likely to, this point becomes actually really important. And this brings me to my second point. As I start to think about kind of what role the state plays in shaping the dynamics that you discuss. So I think we have to ask two related questions. First, what are the causes of shifts in whether a given place is or becomes a production site or a trafficking node? And second, related to the point that I made just a moment ago, what can the state do? What kinds of relationships among violent non-state groups does the state actually prefer? And what might the unintended consequences of the kinds of policies it normally pursues as it seeks to destroy or contain illicit economies? So let's start with this causes of shifts in whether a given place is a production site or a trafficking node. So Annette, in your article, you seem to suggest these places are basically exogenously determined, right? So coca can only be grown in a particular set of places given climatological requirements. Trafficking nodes are determined by either geographic features or proximity to contraband goods or precursors that flow in and out of in from other countries, in our case, Venezuela and Ecuador. So if that were true, then the policy implications of your analysis are straightforward and could either be seen as extremely depressing or actually really encouraging. So let's assume for a second constant demand for illicit goods like coca, because Europeans and Americans like to put cocaine in their noses. And that means that some areas are essentially condemned to being locales that are going to see significant violence and will have like either these competitive or relatively cooperative relationships. At the same time, if the location of these places doesn't change over time that much, that means actually that the state has clear criteria for prioritizing interventions in a determined number of territories. And actually, so in that sense, it's depressing because some places are condemned by geography, but it's encouraging from the public policy side because the state can basically redouble its efforts and geographically focus its attention. But this story that I just told, and I think one that generally you tell in the article, suggests a kind of static view and doesn't allow for a lot of change over time. So the story is one that depends upon primarily spatial variation as opposed to temporal variation, right? But the state can and does intervene in these markets too. And that provides not only spatial, but also temporal variation. So this includes whether at one moment versus another, local officials tolerate the entry and sale of gray market goods. It also is sensitive to shifts in both national and local level eradication efforts, the capture of high value targets like negateo, as you mentioned, that upset some of the relationships that you so thoughtfully describe, Annette. But in other words, there are lots of endogenous dynamics that I actually think are more consequential than the article acknowledges. And this may help us explain also levels of violence as a result. And this brings me to like what the state actually wants. And this I think can generate a discussion about what all this means for peace building and also what I think the state should actually want. So in my view, it should, the state should ultimately acknowledge that demand for cocaine is not going away and should essentially seek harm reduction efforts, that is, reduce the really horrific consequences of combating the production of coca and the transshipment of cocaine. And that might include, for example, inducing, ironically, in an indirect way, the kinds of cooperative arrangements between our groups that you document in your article, Annette, not just at production sites where they're most likely to kind of endogenously or naturally occur, but also at strategic trafficking nodes. So how can that happen? I think that's kind of the the big question for this study for policymakers. Is it possible that trusted brokers could play a parallel role as strategic trafficking nodes, much like they do at production sites? What might have to happen for that to occur? Could like relaxing mano dura law enforcement at these trafficking nodes, would that have the result of increasing the role of trusted brokers? If supply were to increase, for example, profits should theoretically decrease, which would potentially limit the benefits of cutthroat competition in strategic trafficking nodes, which may have the effect of allowing some more cooperative medium-term or cooperative arrangements to occur, which could in turn reduce violence. You mentioned some stuff about intensive social programs and reducing the supply, for example, of unemployed youth that would decrease the benefits of cheating on deals among groups at these strategic trafficking nodes that could lead to greater trustworthiness, more durable arrangements, less violence. I think this conversation is a difficult one to have right now in Colombia in the context of a highly prohibitionist approach to drugs. And very disconcertingly, it seems like the Biden administration has at least tacitly endorsed key pillars of the Duque administration's approach to drugs in Colombia. We can talk about that maybe a little bit more. But I think your article, Annette, forces us to confront some tough truths about the causes and consequences of these cooperative relationships. I think it really very clearly tells us about the importance of pursuing some interventions that could seek to preserve some violence-reducing relationships among groups in coca growing areas, while also helping to encourage the same kinds of relationships in places that are, for the reasons that you so clearly document, more vulnerable to violence due to the supply chain structure. And I think the core question for now is like, what should the state do? Because obviously that wasn't the core interest of this article, and I despise it when reviewers tell me to do things that isn't the main purpose of a given article. But I think for the purposes of this conversation that we're having here today, the big question is, even if the Colombian government, in particular this government, doesn't abandon its highly prohibitionist, highly reactionary approach to psychoactive substances, coca cultivation, consumption, domestic consumption, et cetera, are there ways that we might induce these kinds of cooperative relationships among armed groups that could have harm reduction benefits, like reducing violence among civilians in some of Colombia's most dangerous cities? That's all I have for now. And I look forward to a productive conversation. Thanks.
Amazing, Michael. Thank you so much. And thank you for being, I think, the first discussant we've had on this series who really takes very seriously the invitation to consider the policy implications. And I think that was really, really thorough and fascinating. So we're going to turn over now to the audience for Q&A. So please, if you have a question or a comment, do either raise your hand or type your name or say, hi, me, I have a question in the chat so I can see. Perhaps while people are getting their thoughts together, I'll abuse my chair's priority. And I have a question about the humanitarian impact of these sites and these different the trafficking nodes versus the production sites, and to what extent you are able to tell us something also about the degree, because you've told us about the violence, but perhaps particularly more in terms of the violence that causes humanitarian impacts, whether that's displacement or civilian casualties, etc. I see Andre has a question, so I'll turn over to him next. And please do anyone else who has comments and questions, let me know. Andre.
Thanks, Gwen, and thanks, Annette, for amazing paper. I sort of have two questions, and the first one is, I was wondering whether you had the chance to explore the relationship between legal and illegal actors. I mean, what is the impact that the connection with the legal actors has in the illicit supply chain? And if you have, what is the policy implication? I mean, what could we do about that? Because I think that's one of the gray areas that we really need to explore quite a bit. And then the second question that I have is related with the values that you were talking about, and how you think that it's very important that the state somehow finds way to create different ways to communicate to communities so that the communities don't have to rely on actors like Megateo. And my question is whether the PEDETs and the special development programs and even the voluntary coca crop substitution program were spaces where the state could have done that, but has not done it, and whether that's a missed opportunity now. And what do you think in terms of that? Is that something that has been already lost, or it was a missed opportunity, or not, in terms to try to create a new relationship between state and communities in these areas?
Thank you, Andre. I see we have two more hands, so I'll take. We have three more now, so I think I'll take one more, and then the next two can go into the next round. So I saw Christoph raise his hand first, and then we'll allow Annette and Michael a chance to respond. Otherwise, you'll just collect a very long list of questions and comments. Christoph.
Yeah, thanks, Annette, thanks, Gwen, and thanks, Annette, for the presentation. I have two short questions. First of all, the first is related to what Andre just said. How did the crop substitution program from the peace deal affect the presence of the groups? Was there any significant impact of that? And then the second question would be, how do you see these trafficking routes and presence of armed groups shaped by other illicit goods, such as, for example, the illicit mining activities or gold extraction? Thanks.
Thanks, Christoph. So I'll go to Annette, and then Michael, you're also very welcome to add on to what Annette says. And please, people who would like to ask questions also to Michael, you're encouraged to ask both of our speakers questions. Annette.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks, Michael, for all the comments and the slide also. Amazing. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, also for the other questions you raised. I'll try and start addressing some of Michael's thoughts about the role of the state, especially, and also because you mentioned, well, in a way, it changes the argument if we see the role of the state. And of course, one of the scope conditions that I said in the paper is weak state governance. So that means once we strengthen state governance, things can change a lot, and there's much more potential for improving the situation on the ground, including through the interventions that I mentioned at the beginning. So to me, it means that because one of the ways of looking at the illicit supply chain network is the institutional context, and that is that either there is no strong civilian presence, or there are also instances of corruption, for example, where basically the supply chain networks can happen because the state governance is not strong. That means that by strengthening that, we change the institutional context, and therefore we also change the way in which the network occurs. Now that means then, again, thinking about what to do as the state, well, first of all, the state needs to understand, or the government needs to understand that things are not the same across the territory. So you mentioned these different options. Okay, should we go for the most strongest group first? Should we go for the smaller groups first? That's one way of looking at it. But I think in addition to that, it's important to think through what can be done across the territory. So where do we need, not just what kind of group is relevant for which approach, but because they are interlinked and because they are linked differently depending on where across territory we are, we need to make sure that the government has a differential approach depending on whether it's the production side or whether it's the trafficking node. So basically, what I'm saying is that, yes, of course, we need to understand how each group is functioning and what the goals of each groups are, but it does not help to only look at the groups in terms of criteria, what should be done, but actually what happens in each location. And this is where it's so important to think about the production sites and the trafficking nodes. Now, production site, yes, they are relatively fixed for the reasons you mentioned. I mean, there's some movement. There are mobile laboratories, for example, that can be moved across the border, and you see certain shifts. Where there's more movement is, for example, with the trafficking routes, basically the transportation routes. right now in Colombia, even the river system is very important in transporting that. Roads are important. Now, what happens if there's a better road infrastructure, for example, in rural areas? Yes, on the one hand, it can benefit the illicit economy, but if there's a better road infrastructure combined with better accountable presence by state institutions, that can also mean that this infrastructure can no longer be used to transport those drugs. So that's one component where the trafficking nodes themselves might be changed, or the situation at the trafficking nodes might be changed depending on the strength of the state governance. And again, the most important thing is it's not enough to have police or military presence. It's important to have accountable police and military presence combined with the civilian institutions that are necessary. Now, with regard to the asymmetry, or basically what the power relations are, here the most interesting thing to look at, I think, is what happened through the demobilization of the FARC. Because when the FARC was still there, there was in many regions, there was a power asymmetry where basically the FARC were controlling the area, where they were the preponderant group, which meant that they imposed what I call shadow citizenship. So you have a mutually reinforcing relationship between the local community and the FARC. Now, when they left, that asymmetry was gone as well. And in many places, what you had was a more equal power relationship, which also made the situation less stable. So basically, in areas where there was a certain stability, that changed. And of course, that right now makes it also harder to address what's actually going on. But let me link that to the humanitarian impact that Gwen mentioned, because I think it's very much related. What kind of humanitarian impact do we see in which areas? Well, in those areas where we have stable arrangements, and especially before, when there was one dominant group, or if we look at the ELN in Arauca, for example, today, often you might not necessarily see the large-scale violence that we see in other places, but we see confinement. People cannot leave the territory, or people live under social control. They're not allowed to spread information. They're not allowed to speak about human rights violations. So there's lots of pressure, but it doesn't attract the same kind of attention that other areas do where you have the large-scale violence. And then in addition to that, in areas like Tumaco, in urban areas, what we also often see as impact is intra-urban displacement. So you would have people, because there are so many different groups present, and even one barrio is controlled by one group, another barrio by another, and that alliance can shift very quickly. That means that locals have to sometimes go or flee from one barrio to another barrio, rather than leaving the area entirely, which again means that it's not captured as well as the kind of massive displacements are in areas where you see large-scale armed clashes. Now that again means that it's much harder to make that visible, to help those people, because it's not captured, and it puts people more at risk because of the instability. So there are different types of humanitarian impact depending on where you are, and the most important thing I think here is that, yes, physical violence and lethal violence, of course, is terrible, but there are other forms of violence that are also terrible. There are other forms of suffering that need to be addressed differently, but that also count. And this again comes back to this differential approach that needs to be taken across the territory, because we cannot help everyone in the same way. Now, that brings me to another point that Andre made, I think, about, well, first about the values and the PDEs and the crop substitution. I think one issue here is to make sure, of course, not everything can be done at the same time everywhere, but you can have success models that then can also show others that things can actually work. So just one example, in 2017, when I went to one of the areas close of in Putumayo, people, local communities were asking me about the potential eradication, and they were asking, well, what shall we do if they come? Shall we start to fight? Because we don't know what will happen next. We don't know if actually there is a substitution afterwards. So that, of course, also is related to past experiences. It's related to people's memories and potential disappointments in the past. If you can show certain success models, even if it's not happening everywhere at the same time, at least that also gives people hope, and it shows that it's credible. It shows that promises are not just made, they're also being kept. And I think that's a way of moving forward, where disappointments have happened already, but where you can actually try and bring back that hope by showing that even though it doesn't happen everywhere at the same time, it can happen in certain areas. On the relation between legal and illegal, that's perhaps one of the most, one of the trickiest parts in this whole situation, because of course it is very much interlinked. We often see that certain brokers, I mean, in the past, there have been examples of brokers being involved both in the legal and in the illegal economy. We also need to be careful because the same routes that are being used for the illicit economy are used for the legal economy as well. That is relevant if we look, for example, at gasoline smuggling. I mean, how can you actually cut off the illicit flows without harming the licit part of that? People's livelihoods depend on that as well. So that is a tricky question, where I think the most important point is understanding that it is all interlinked, right? And that is not a singular chain, but networks. And those networks interlink both with several illicit flows, but also with the illicit economy, the legal economy. So thinking about what the side effects might be when deciding on a certain action is very important, because it has those side effects on local communities. And if the decision is that something needs to be cut off, then there need to be alternatives for those local communities that are not involved in the illicit economy, but yet they suffer from those actions. Also, of course, again, with regard to the brokers, that is, of course, also something that is not just limited to Colombia. I mean, also in the past, there have been brokers like Walid Makled, for example, in Venezuela, who was operating across the Colombia-Venezuela border, and it extends beyond the border area, and again, both in the legal and in the illegal economy. So it's also important to think about the international context. In the end, this is a global supply chain network. It's not something that is confined to Colombia, so it's important to think through what happens across the border in neighboring countries, but of course then also what Michael also mentioned about the markets in the United States and in Western Europe, obviously, as well. On the point about how the routes are shaped by other illicit goods, that was Christoph's point, I think. Yes, I guess, as I said right now already, they are very much connected in terms of the networks. So you'd have arms smuggling, ammunition smuggling, even human trafficking that occurs on the same routes. So often there's a direct exchange. There were cases where trucks, for example, and that's explained that in my Borderland Battles book, where trucks across the border between Colombia and Venezuela going in one way carry gasoline, in the other way they carry cocaine. So there's a direct exchange between different types of illicit flows. And of course, where they're being exchanged, these are again the trafficking nodes where we see those unstable arrangements that affect local communities as well. Apart from this interconnected nature of those different types of illicit flows, of course, there's also a diversification of the illicit economy. You mentioned mining. Well, again, we see here the relationship between those different types of illicit income sources. There were cases where once a cocaine shipment was lost, that's when the extortion rate went up, for example. Or when, the cocaine trade might not work that well in one part anymore, this is where then the illicit mining becomes more important. So again, thinking about this as a complex system rather than individual chains or individual economies, individual groups, that is very important to see what happens if you are basically act in one area, what are the repercussions on other areas. I realize
Annette, I think you've managed to cover everything. That's very impressive. I think I'll hand over quickly to Michael to see if he would like to add anything, because we've got about 5 questions for the next round. So, Michael, would you like to contribute to this round?
Yeah, sure.
Of discussion.
I'm happy to do so. Thanks, Gwen, and thanks, Annette. So, maybe I'll address 2 things that, for reasons that will become clear, I think of as being interlinked. So, about the question regarding PEDETs, I think we don't have a great sense. So like I'm interested in impact evaluation. I think we don't have really great sense of how the PEDET approach to building consensus locally, if that produces gains in welfare, if that produces gains in security, if that makes people feel safer. So we have a 12,000 person survey that we ran about a year and a half ago now. I've lost all sense of time in COVID times. Late 2019 is when we ran it. And what we find is that people seem to suggest that now they're experiencing less violence, although there's variation across space. And here, maybe I'll put up I was just looking for this. I'll put up another PowerPoint slide very quickly to just show you that more than half of those in the PEDET. So these are surveys that are representative at the level of each PEDET, the 16 PEDETs. And basically, prior to the signing of the peace agreement in 2016, they said that at least one armed actor, basically mandaba, ruled in their community. And today, in the last 6 months, that is in 2019, that figure is now around 30%. And of course, there's a lot of spatial clustering about where that occurs. So Arauca in particular is something that Annette mentioned, where the ELN has essentially uncontested territorial control today. And I think this kind of flows into another question, which is about the humanitarian consequences, something that Annette touched on as well. So I think we need to decide what we prefer. And this is a very, very difficult question to answer from both a humanitarian perspective, from a normative perspective. Like, do you prefer rebel governance, which can be highly repressive, illiberal, stifling, but potentially absent some of the very obvious trauma that is associated with territorial clashes between the state and rebel groups or among rebel groups? Or do you prefer those clashes between the state and rebel groups and among rebel groups? And I think we're very uncomfortable asking that question, but it's a very practical, real world question that I think we have to deal with. And I think to be able to deal with that, we need to better measure what those affectations, I don't know if that's a word in English, but that's what it would be in Spanish. Affectations would be at mental health, at a level of mental health, at a level of like social and economic welfare, and actual exposure to physical bodily harm, as Annette mentioned. And I think for some, I kind of work on state building, and it makes me uncomfortable when we blindly say that we should go full throttle towards some state building interventions that could result in these disruptions and these dislocations that produce massive displacement or human suffering, when actually, if the Colombian state can't afford to project power into every corner of its territory, we may actually be better kind of devolving authority to rebel groups or to criminal groups and let them have monopolistic control over particular territories. It's super controversial position, but I think it's worth having that conversation, because if we don't, then we are kind of condemned to repeat the errors of the past. That's it.
No, thank you so much for making that point, Michael. I think thank you for the provocation, because I remember talking to the FARC during the period of disarmament in 2017, and they had the idea that they were going to build the state. I mean, the whole idea was that the FARC were going to be involved in local state building, and the FARC, who had been the state, were going to then transition to being the legal state. And that was a really interesting idea, and I thought it actually could have worked really well, which of course it didn't end up happening in that way. We have 5 questions, so I'm going to ask each of the 5 people to ask their question, make their comment, and then we'll go back to the speakers, who do not need to respond to everything in detail, but maybe can try to weave things together. So the first who raised their hand was Frank.
Hi, Annette. Thank you so much for presenting your work. It's really, really interesting. I just had a question. It seemed like most of what your paper focused on was competition and cooperation between kind of distinct groups. And I was wondering if you think that this also has implications for kind of consolidation or fragmentation within groups. And I'm thinking specifically of like the FARC dissidents and how we've seen both of those things happening over the last couple of years.
Thanks, Frank. Jorge.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen. And thank you to Rodeemos del Diálogo and for convening, and Annette and Professor Weintraub for the comments and the insights. I would like to move a bit beyond the article itself and build from the points raised by Professor Weintraub at the end on the implications, roles of the state, and possibilities of harm reduction, and maybe Annette also thinking, and sorry for the self-promotion, the project you are implementing with the Canadian government now. Well, your views and thoughts of another actor, which is organized civil society, particularly international and local, and their role in these spaces and with these groups. Your views on the implications for local peace building and how can they catalyze or be part in the construction of some sort of confidence building measures with those actors. I know it's very sensitive and there's all these questions of do no harm, but organized civil society can do, or if it can play a role in creating some harm reduction conditions with the actors. I don't want to talk about peace negotiations because that's the prerogative of the Colombian government, but at least look for some conditions to reduce violence in those territories and find some agreements, or let's call them like that, with the illegal actors. Thanks.
Thank you, Jorge. The next question we had in the chat was from Chris Lucy. I'm going to read it out. And he writes, if money flow is perceived as the fuel for the activities of these groups and the state gets foreign aid to suppress them, how can reducing sanctions, i.e. decriminalizing coca, or can decriminalizing coca or reducing sanctions on coca reduce the frictions and improve the humanitarian conditions? And then the next question is Eduardo.
Thank you, Gwen. And thank you for sharing your work with us today. I'm interested in how mediator figures and sort of common dialogue platforms are established in conflict scenarios. So in that line, I don't know if you could tell us a bit more about how a figure like Megateo assumes the role you described. I mean, you did mention that these were long processes, very difficult to replace. So I don't know, is there anything else that you can tell us? Is there anything we can learn to understand sort of the rationale of violent non-state groups and sort of actively promote other more desirable forms of dialogue and mediation? Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. And then we just have one final question, which is from Tatiana. And she writes, thank you, Annette, for your presentation. And she's asking, maybe both of you, if you know, or if you could tell us something about the role of violent non-state groups in illegal mining, especially in Nariño, one of the areas that you highlighted, but also in other areas, and whether these actors also establish similar or different types of cooperation in relation to this activity. So perhaps this time we'll go backwards. We'll start with Michael, if you want to address a few of the issues, and then we'll hand over to Annette for her to answer the questions and make her final comments.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with, so I don't know much about illegal mining in Nariño. Annette will for sure know a lot more about that than me. Maybe I'll just talk very briefly about Chris's question about how decriminalizing, I guess, the production, I'm assuming you mean production of coca, might improve humanitarian conditions. So again, assume that Europeans and Americans like to consume cocaine, and that there are very few places in the world that can actually meet that demand. You know, coca will be grown in Colombia for the foreseeable future, if not forever. And so it's very clear that given the current legal framework in Colombia, we are pushing illegal armed groups to make more money because it is illegal to grow coca in Colombia. And so the theory goes, anyway, that if we were to decriminalize, this should reduce incentives for, well, first for farmers to grow it, I guess, but also for armed groups to traffic it. And I think, you know, at least, you know, decriminalization efforts in other countries have shown that decriminalization doesn't like destroy the illegal market, at least in consumer countries. That is definitely the case with the United States. Decriminalizing marijuana, for example, in places like Washington, Oregon, and Colorado did not eliminate the market for illegal marijuana. It just created a parallel market Something similar potentially could happen here if legalization of cultivation actually occurs. But it would require a regulatory framework that could kind of that could reduce incentives for armed groups to use violence, to coerce local farmers. And I think it would definitely be a net good. I'm definitely a pro legalization person. And I would think I will leave everything else for Annette because. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Michael. Annette.
Thanks. Yeah, just quickly also on this last point about decriminalization. Another promo for my forthcoming book on transforming the war on drugs, where we have, together with Juan Corazon Vergara, where we look exactly at that, what are the possibilities, how can drug policies be changed. I mean, there are, of course, models like Bolivia, where, for example, the legal market is used, and that can change the entire structure. Again, that needs to be seen in the context of the global illicit supply chain network, right? In terms of what this then means with the balloon effect, where then certain areas are shifting, including across the border, where they might come back. So it's definitely, yes, I mean, it's definitely a point that needs to be considered in the entire debate. The question is how you can move forward with that. And we were at the point in 2016 where drug policy reform was on the table. It didn't quite work out in the way that many people had hoped for. But again, having this in the debate is important to move forward, definitely. On the illegal mining that was mentioned by Tatiana, I've looked at that actually also in other contexts in the DRC, in the Congo, for example, where I also found that the illicit supply chain network was working very similarly in the context of illegal mining. And also in Nariño, in the Colombian context, I mean, again, if you think about what actually happens in the process, right? It's the extraction of the resource, it's the processing, somewhat depending on the type of mining, but then also the transport, and then the if there's an international component, there's this as well. So you have definitely those different steps, and you usually also have different groups involved. So there, I can't tell you with absolute certainty that everything you can just take from the cocaine production to the illicit mining, but you certainly have moments where you have this short-term cooperation, because it is about a one-off deal, and then you have other areas, the mine basically, where it's more stable long-term. So there are lessons to be learned, definitely. On the mediation, how did, Eduardo, I think was your question, how did Megatio achieve to be in that position? I mean, he used to be the leader of the EPL. He was very long embedded in that local in that region. People were knowing him very well. That's why he was seen as a brother, as a role model. So he had these close ties with the communities, while at the same time he had the respect from the other armed actors because of his leadership role in the EPL. In terms of mediation, I mean, I would be very careful, because they are brokering illicit business deals. They're not brokering peace-building measures. It would be interesting to think through whether something like that is an option. But definitely, I mean, again, what the added or what the advantage is that they have basically good networking skills, if you want, across different sectors of society. So that includes the very local level, the community, but it usually also includes the elite, the economic elite, often also state, and it includes the different armed actors. So it's across those different sectors and different parts of society, if you want, and both legal and illegal actors, which makes them so powerful. And again, this is not just something that happens in Colombia. We see that in Venezuela. Victor Bo is a very known Russian figure who had similar powers. So that's something, again, where we can learn from other cases as well. But I would be cautious with saying whether this can be used in mediation. But I would have to think about it more. On the question about what happens in terms of, Frank asked that, consolidation, fragmentation within groups. That's an interesting question. In the appendix of the paper, actually, I talk about that, and I talk about how we can think through what this means for inside a group, or how do we know where one group ends and the next group starts, especially if you have a looser structure where you have an umbrella type of organization and then the smaller subgroups underneath that. I would say that you can basically see something very similar. So once these groups become sufficiently independent, so if you have different fronts or different dissidents and they are operating differently because of a different local commander, then some of them would engage very differently in that cooperation. Now, the crucial point here is the mistrust. So basically the starting point, as I said before, is that those different groups don't trust each other. And that's why they need to find certain mechanisms to reduce that distrust. So if you now have several dissident groups, the question is, to what extent are they still operating under the same leadership? If they do, then you would probably not assume that there's distrust, because there's certain cohesion which makes them cooperating anyways, right? If that gets looser, and now we could also think about what this means in terms of implications for the ELN, which is much less hierarchical but more networked, and you don't have that same leadership, that then means that you can have more distrust between the groups, which then leads them to require those mechanisms to reduce that. And that could then produce the unstable short-term cooperation rather than the long-term stable one, which would be almost as if they're in the same group. So the question is really, to what extent are they operating independent? The more independent they operate, the more likely I think we can expect there to be rather unstable short-term arrangements. And then on the question by Jorge on organized civil society, and what can be done at the local level as well, that's of course a crucial, very important point. With our ConPeace program, we organize civil society workshops in the border areas. Now we're doing online focus groups as well. But basically what we've seen is from that work that those local initiatives exist, right? They often exist, but they're disconnected from what happens at the central government level. So first of all, and that brings me to the point also that Gwen mentioned about what at a time was something that people thought about in terms of the FARC becoming the ones who might have this local governance function, but as part of the state, right? That is relevant if we think about trust relationships, because local communities who have those initiatives, who have had the close interaction, who have had to have this close interaction with the armed actor before, they might still have closer trust relationships with that actor rather than the state actor. And again, I mean, I'm sure many of you as well, we have the evidence about local people saying, well, they don't trust the police, the military, they don't know that territory, whereas the armed actor, especially in those areas of preponderance, they knew them. So what does this mean? Well, it means that in a way, local civil society, organized civil society, they have knowledge about the local dynamics, but they also have knowledge about the dynamics of the armed actors, perhaps in some ways in a closer way, obviously, than the state. This is why we've seen in many territories peace communities, peace zones. In San Diego, I've done work on that, in Las Mercedes, Gwen's work obviously as well. So the way in which civil society is organized, I think, is quite strong. The question is, how can those initiatives be supported rather than ignored or disregarded, and in order to bring in new initiatives that might be less effective. So I think it's building on those trust relationships and on the local knowledge that is already there that is important, and bringing this local knowledge closer together with the capacities that the central government has or should have in order to then promote confidence building measures, as you mentioned as well, and these local peace process, because we know, again, from experiences like Red at Paz in the past, for example, that these can have a bottom-up effect, and that ultimately you can connect those local initiatives with the initiatives run by the state in order to be mutually reinforcing. And I leave it here.
Amazing, Annette. Thank you so much for your rigorous response, and to Michael for your engagement in this topic as well. I think it's been a really fascinating discussion. Perhaps I'll just end with 3 very brief thoughts. First of all, I think we've really had a very in-depth discussion about the multifaceted challenges of coca and other illegal economies and the relationships between armed groups, and the challenges that brings for peace building. The second point is the fact that this demand clearly isn't going away, as Michael said, and that it is an international problem with an international dimension, and that the Colombian state needs to engage in forms of harm management, which, and I think Annette has really highlighted the fact that you can't do this with a cookie cutter approach to all the different territories. There are clearly vast territorial differences, not only geographically, but also with regards to the trafficking nodes versus the production site differences. And this is incredibly relevant for all of the discussions that are ongoing about how to implement point 4, whether to use a more holistic approach or whether to, which I think quite rightly many of us who follow the Colombian peace process are rather resistant to, the kind of more militarized aerial spraying and so forth. And finally, I think that the issue of trust, which Annette has underlined, I think is really interesting. And I really found fascinating the quote that you shared with us, Annette, of the idea of Megateo being someone who was quote unquote trustworthy to everyone, or made himself into a figure that was trustworthy of everyone. And I think that trust is very much the currency of peace building and the kind of the main emotion in a way that is needed to cultivate in peace building, because the problem is with state building is that quite often communities don't trust in the state because there is a history of state violence and because the state has historically quote unquote abandoned large swathes of the country. So this is also something that perhaps the state needs to learn from, the techniques that have actually worked in rebel governance, in order to think about how it creates state presence in different territories that is going to be long-term, that is going to be reliable, that is not going to be corrupt or engaging in supporting illicit economy flows, and that is not going to continually make promises that it then reneges on, right? Which is the kind of the continual stereotype of the non-compliant state. So I think that leaves us with many, many challenges for the future. But I would just like to end by thanking my speakers again for coming and sharing their knowledge with us, and